Today I want to continue our discussion about philosophy and the question of why philosophize. I want to begin by discussing realism, which most of us have very little difficulty with, right? That we have a mundane understanding of our bodies, the objects we encounter in the world, other people. And so, the mundane world, which is certainly useful, we get along, and we don't have any problem with that. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here. In the case of philosophy, there are lots of different gradations when it comes to reality itself. You can think of it this way. The sciences and the social sciences tend to give us, if you think about a room, they're very good at telling us what's in the room. They can describe it and analyze it. We benefit richly from science and the scientific attitude towards reality. But the room itself, that there is a room, that is the special area of focus from philosophy. Arguably, it has been the area of focus from the very onset of philosophy in ancient Greece. Well, it actually didn't begin then, but with a famous poem by Parmenides entitled aptly "The Real." Okay, so, but I should say before proceeding that there are a couple of different variations on realism, which is what we're talking about today. There's, of course, the scientific approach, which is scientific realism, and that view is sometimes held in philosophy to be the attitude whereby one can correlate all physical and mental events with a correlate in the natural world, right? And this we can measure and do graphs and studies of. There are other forms of realism, right? There's artistic realism. We see that in the visual arts all the time. And in particular, I would draw your attention to the realism of poetry. Okay? The really curious thing about the poet is that through the use of words and language, which is the main area of focus of analytic philosophy, through the words of the analysis of words and reality itself, we can have a direct or describe a direct encounter with reality. And this is kind of direct realism, right? In the case of analytic philosophy, there's the assumption, generally speaking, that objects and sentences are real. They make an existential assumption. And the poet is working in that kind of terrain as well. And I think I've mentioned that poetry has a great deal in common with philosophy. At the other end of the spectrum is kind of the existential realism of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, or the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. There are nuances in each of those instances, and we won't get into them today. Today I want to talk about a really interesting form of realism, and that's Platonic realism. Now, oftentimes it's said that Plato is an idealist, and that the ideal form is his version of reality, and that's fine as far as it goes. We love dichotomies, but it doesn't fully represent the richness of Plato's approach to realism. A better, more nuanced account would stress, I think, the abstract expression of something is more real. Okay, that avoids the whole materialist idealist dichotomy. Because let's face it, there are some accounts of materialism that are just so nuanced that they're very close to idealism, and certainly the opposite is true. So if you think about the mundane perspective on reality, who we are, right? We kind of have a handle on that. But there are certain times when, the mundane perspective really doesn't give us a full answer, full accounting. We ask the question, who am I? Certainly I can do a biological description, a physical description, but that doesn't capture my personality or yours. It doesn't account for the human experience of other people. And so for that, we need to kind of elevate our thinking to take it up a notch beyond sense perception, as Plato argues, and use different senses, the eye of reason, as it's sometimes referred to. And we need to think a little more seriously about questions about who we are and what society is about. I used the example of the economic collapse in 2008 in the United States, and certainly there's an empirical description we could go through, the derivatives debacle and the subprime issues, and we can describe that in great and excruciating detail, as indeed many economists have. But in order to really understand that, we have to see at a different level, right? We have to bring into account different concepts. So we have to use the eye of reason, and we have to start talking about things like market psychology and political power, things which are a lot more difficult to define in a satisfying way. So there are occasions where, Plato does seem to have a pretty fulsome argument here that, and he would agree with perhaps 20th century social philosophers, that there's a pseudo-concrete, right? There's a pseudo, immediate reality that can be very misleading, right? If I conduct a study in an incorrect way, well, when I do a survey research, well, I don't capture the full measure of the audience I'm trying to capture, well, I might get skewed results, right? And I could present them as empirically valid, and certainly they would cross the T's and dot the I's, but they would be misleading in that regard. So for Plato, the best guardian against that is the use of logic and the model of math, and by that he means one should acquaint themselves with thinking abstractly about reality, about the things one encounters in reality, and try to grasp them at a different level. Now, we're just not pulling things out of air. That's done all the time too, as we know. We test by using the technique specific to philosophy of logic, right? And, the logician starts with the premise that in order for something to be, it has to be in time, and it can't both be and not be at one and the same instance. So on the basis of that very kind of rudimentary form of logic that traces back to our friend Parmenides and later was refined by Aristotle, we can form various types of logic, which is, after all, a language. And so Plato, in inviting us to think about the nature of reality, is challenging us to put aside the mundane perspective for a second and just ask ourselves, how is it that we know? Do we really know all that we know? Does it stand up to the sustained inquiry of logic, of our own, counterexamples when we make statements? And to seek, this deeper understanding of reality. So I use the example of the human person, and certainly we're bodies, we're minds, or brains, if you prefer. But is that the most real thing that we can say about ourselves? Certainly we are those, that is true. But we're also a synthesis of all that, right? We're personality. When we lose somebody that we love and we see them sadly in an open casket or something, right? What's missing? Well, what's missing is their personality, right, and who they were. And for Plato, that's a seminal event, right? The most important thing to us, who are we, is not really answered by just restricting ourselves to sense perception. So, think a little bit more deeply. That's the message of Plato about the nature of the nature of the real, and it's not as cut and dry as perhaps we would like to think. Although the caveat here is that there is absolutely nothing wrong with the mundane perspective. We don't want to, and there are variations on realism, right? This is not the final word. I should say a word just briefly, because Plato has such a large footprint in philosophy and just in the life of the mind generally. The huge influence he had on Christianity and Christian theology in particular, and also Islamic theology, I should say, as well, and to a certain extent also Judaism. And it's the idea that our realism is such that we existed before we physically exist. To be as free, the philosopher, theologian Origen says, as we were before we existed. Okay, so there's this notion that we are as potentiality enjoying a kind of existence before we actually physically exist. And of course, a long history to this idea, and it's not for everyone, and there are lots of holes that one can poke in it. But it's an interesting kind of idea, an interesting theological idea, especially when we get into other topics such as the immortality of the soul. Okay, so that's our little study of Platonic realism. As I said, lots to say, more to say about this, but we could go on forever, really.